Turning now to criminal justice responses. We've heard through the last day and a half that a significant proportion of offenders who have contact with police are experiencing cannabis-related problems. We know that police can play a role and are eager and effective in doing so in community education and referral to treatment. And also we've had examples of great partnerships with local agencies. I've taken these slides from Katie Willis's NCPIC bulletin. I'm not a policing specialist, but these are the things that she identified about policing street-level cannabis markets. These markets are closed markets, they're not open street-based markets. Most people get their cannabis from friends or grow it themselves. So you need to be using more proactive policing, of course, because you can't just move off people in the street. So it's around problem-oriented policing, and this is where working with community-identified issues, third-party policing through community groups or your own youth networks. I'll talk a little bit more about drug diversion, and I heard yesterday projects about drug nuisance abatement strategies, although they were around alcohol, but you can use the same thing with cannabis, of course, using council fines for various activities that might arise from cannabis use, the disorderly conduct, littering, whatever you've got. Another important police activity is roadside drug testing around cannabis. This is an area where there's still great mythology. People haven't caught up to the better analytical techniques we have now. You still hear I drive much more safely when I'm stoned, I drive so much more slowly, yada, yada, yada. And they were supported because we couldn't detect cannabis intoxication. As you know, cannabis lasts a long time in the body with heavy smokers, and so if you detect cannabis in the urine, it doesn't mean anything about impairment. But now we have blood tests which are able to measure impairment, and they now tell us that there is a 2 to 3-fold risk of causing road traffic accidents when you're driving intoxicated. We now have targeted roadside drug testing now in all jurisdictions, and generally speaking, it's been found that those that test positive tend to be male, tend to drive more, tend to be dependent users, so they're smoking all the time, or early onset users, inexperienced, not real smart to be driving around with a joint in your fingers, and also just not share the understanding and belief that cannabis use does affect driving. Police diversion, just a little bit about this because there's been a lot of discussion about this in relation to alcohol and other programs. It varies very much across jurisdictions between a simple caution, so it's all done on the spot, through to sending people to second and third level diversions, which involve assessment of their personal cannabis use and even then on to treatment. Peter Hommel and others at the AIC have evaluated the effectiveness of police diversion, and even across the various levels of offending types and intervention complexities, they find that they have a positive outcome. They also identified that one of the barriers for police using the diversion models is that, and I'm sure this is completely realistic, that they don't feel they get feedback from people that they refer. I mean, have I done any good by doing this, or could I have just done what I normally do? And also some uncertainty about whether or not it's effective. So please rest assured that it does have a positive effect. The other level of diversion, of course, is court diversion, where drug users are offenders and are brought before the court. Similarly, we have very great variation here between how it's operationalised across jurisdictions, the type of offences, the timing, whether it's pre or post sentence, and the type of intervention. However, we see again clear benefits for program completers, for drug use and for reoffending. So the next stage of that is a rigorous cost-effectiveness type studies, and they're yet to be completed. I'd just like to mention one of my pet projects, sorry about that, but I think it's a good one, is the Weeded Out project, and it has won awards, so other people like it too. Mick Dowie, when he was up in Cairns, was the instigator of this program, where communities were feeding back to him. Firstly, he was concerned about amphetamine trafficking, but the community was concerned about cannabis. And it was a real challenge for law enforcement, and he needed then to join up with health services to have a joint agency response, and to also accompany his supply reduction with demand reduction and crime prevention. So he formed partnerships, he and his colleagues, with these groups. And these are examples of some of the posters that have been developed by prisoners, Indigenous prisoners in Lotus Glen, for example, as part of the community work. He went and discussed with all of the elected representatives and leaders across Cape York and the Torres Strait communities, and they've embraced these crime prevention strategies and are working with the agencies to reduce the availability of cannabis, because they know exactly who's bringing it in and where through, and it was just having me feeling empowered to do something. And the end result is that the frequency of Crime Stoppers and crime intelligence reports have risen substantially, and this is displaying the public confidence in the project. It's been funded by Queensland Health, by Queensland Police. James Cook University is leading a big study that NCPIC is also involved in, that's funded by the NHMRC, to look at the demand reduction activities and to evaluate it. So it's certainly had the highest level of support for health and police. So we're very thrilled about that. Very briefly on health initiatives. It might seem ironic to think about screening and assessment and interventions for cannabis-related problems in prisons as an adult, as a primary prevention, but as we've already heard, this is the group that goes out and raises the next generation of adolescent cannabis users at the high end of the continuum. So if we can start intervening with parents first, that would be terrific. There's also a screaming need for some sort of systematic intervention amongst young people in juvenile detention. And sadly, it's the only time I've ever had to give back money was when I tried to do such a study. But I'm willing to try again because I think it's incredibly important, but I think we need to do it within detention, not in the community, because we couldn't get enough referrals from community juvenile justice agencies. Looking at evidence-based interventions within diversion schemes that offer individual, group, family and community-wide interventions that are tailored to need rather than a standardised type intervention. An intervention that I find useful and is being well supported, it's well published, started in the US, is a check-up kind of model. I haven't got time to talk about it here, but it's a really useful intervention for young people who aren't looking for treatment. It's designed to increase motivation to think about change, but interestingly we find it does provoke quite significant change in cannabis use, and it's really just a 2-session intervention where information is collected, talked about cannabis in a very non-judgmental way, and then people are provided feedback in a way that develops motivation and reduces resistance, just saying, well, you said you use this much and it's causing these kinds of problems. And it really does get young people thinking very much about needing to make change. So the sorts of interventions I would support, as I just said, a check-up style for non-treatment seekers. It's a gentle way to start with kids in detention, for example, who, talk to the hand, don't need treatment, haven't got a problem. Although, to be fair, in surveys that I've done in juvenile justice, 30% felt that they had a problem with their cannabis use. And I was pretty astounded that on average 16-year-old males were willing to make that attribution about themselves. For those that are treatment seeking, similarly we can use that brief check-up model. For those who are interested, the Cannabis Youth Treatment Experiment that Mike Dennis did tested 5 kinds of interventions, and they were all effective in the short term. So I'm happy if you want to contact me to know more about those. Howard Little's intensive multidimensional family therapy has the best outcomes for adolescents with complex psychosocial problems and deeply entrenched in criminal offending, for example. A very expensive and intensive program, but good results. And while we have no trials of residential treatment for cannabis use disorders as such, those services are designed as treating the whole person for all kinds of drugs, and there's no difference in outcomes between those with cannabis problems and those not. And interestingly, we recently published a study of young people in drug and alcohol treatment, and it was the cannabis users who needed the longer stays and had the more complex psychosocial problems than the heroin users and the amphetamine type stimulants and the alcohol. So we were very surprised about that. So a final ad for NCPIC. There's our web address. Please visit us. Some of the things that you might see there is our young people site, and this is for community young people. It's not designed to particularly appeal to offender populations, but it's just 9 stories about using cannabis, and it's designed in a sort of a Facebook style, if you like. To talk about different messages. It's designed to appeal to different ethnic groups, and differing age and genders are reflected. So it's just a QA type model that you might want to direct people to. We also have a free national information and helpline that anyone can ring up and ask questions about anything to do with cannabis, and they can also get brief telephone interventions there, up to 4 sessions. We have a whole bunch of resources. Please come and have a look. We also have free national clinical training and specific youth sector materials and training, and we're about to have a web-based intervention materials for young people developed through Youth on the Streets, and already well focus tested with kids with very significant cannabis problems and criminal offending. Another project you'll see there is one of our Indigenous ones, Cannabis, It's Not Our Culture, a way of community engagement around cannabis with these communities, some very remote, as you can see. My staff, they're out in Kintor. They had to sleep by the side of the road to get there. There's nothing a NCPIC won't do for cannabis interventions. And it's with 7 communities nationally. We have an Indigenous health workers website with a range of materials and an ongoing small grant scheme for these communities, which are involving sports teams and things like that. So, in conclusion, responses to reducing cannabis-related crime, starting with supply control, combined with demand reduction in communities and diversion programs, school and family-based interventions, both universal and targeted. Overall, an understanding of the role of culture and gender and their place in interventions, and with those structural determinants and community engagement. We've learnt that the group that we're having least success with are those that are dependent and with mental health comorbidities. There's not a single intervention I can point to with an evidence base for those with serious mental health problems and cannabis use. That's a huge gap. And whilst I'm a psychologist, so not the first person to reach for the drug shelf, we really do need some pharmacotherapies for the management of cannabis withdrawal and craving. And I'm thrilled to say we're about to start the first study of Sativex, which is an oral spray, a mix of those 2 THC and CBD cannabinoids, grown in a lovely laboratory in Kent in the UK that I went to visit. No free samples, sadly. And that is the most promise for helping people get through withdrawal, because that is the first barrier to getting into abstinence, and secure abstinence is getting through withdrawal and managing craving. So the OT there is oxytocin, which is the feel-good hormone that we release when we breastfeed and orgasm, and that's had success with in other drug groups, and we're also keen to look at that as well, and we're starting some early stage research. So thank you very much.